What is the most horrifying piece of information you have to share? Story 1. The American blood supply runs on about a 2 to 3 day buffer for most products. If for some reason the entire system shut down for a couple of weeks, people would die for lack of transfusions. And while at least 60% of our citizens are eligible to donate blood, only 5% of those people ever will. If that number went to around 8%, no blood bank would ever need to call you again. Story 2. That doctors admitted to euthanizing patients at Memorial Medical Center Hospital in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina because their only other option was to leave them to die. Several were charged, but have defended their decisions as the only humane choice in an impossible situation. One patient in particular was not terminal, but due to his size, was unable to be moved. I knew her. Lost touch when I moved away after Katrina. I don't believe it was done out of malice. It really was a horrible situation that they were faced with. I was there during Katrina. It was a very unnerving feeling to know that you are literally trapped with no power, water, or food. I've never heard it quite like trying to sleep on the second floor of a building with 4 feet of water on the first floor. Story 3, carbon dioxide, was blamed for the deaths of around 1,700 people in Cameroon, West Africa, in 1986, when a massive release of gas occurred from Lake Nyos, a volcanic crater lake. The clinical findings in 845 survivors seen at or admitted to hospital were compatible with exposure to an asphyxiant gas. They were just sleeping when the lake released a giant cloud of CO2 and wiped out almost an entire village. Story 4. The Byford Dolphin Accident. November 5th, 1983. 4 saturation divers were in a decompression chamber, which was pressurized to 9 atmosphere, when one of the tenders outside released the docking collar of the diving bell before the diver inside had closed the hatch all the way, resulting in an explosive decompression of the chamber, killing all 4 of the divers and the tender who caused it. The diver who was near the hatch was sucked out of the chamber from a small gap, along with all the air rushing out. Due to lack of better words, he was literally turned into pulp, and his remains were sprayed all over the deck outside. Story 5. For a lot of people, the first sign of cardiovascular disease is sudden death. My husband thought he'd pulled a muscle. It kept getting worse, so finally in May, he went to urgent care. He was having a heart attack, but the tech doing the ECG was confused and went to get the doctor. The ECG machine was showing a heart attack. His blood pressure, though, was on the low end of normal. If they'd just taken his blood pressure, they'd have said he was fine and sent him home. Thankfully, when he said his chest hurt, he jumped to the front, and then when the doctor confirmed that the tech was reading it right, they put him in an ambulance over to the university hospital where the cardiac team is. Story 6. In early May of 1898, a 10-year-old boy named Joseph Bufoncio was playing at the corner of 3rd and Jackson in what was known as the Great Jackson Street Chuck Hole. It was 8 feet deep and 16 feet wide. The local children loved to play in these large pools of muck. These children would build rafts and push themselves across these miniature lakes by using poles to push them along. In doing so, at 4:30 p.m., Joseph's pole got stuck at the bottom of the chuck hole, and he fell in and sank to the bottom. This event was such a huge spectacle that up to 2,000 voyeurs watched at what was described as a comical event as men clumsily struggled to retrieve the boy's body. One by one, they fell into the muddy mess as the crowd cheered and laughed. It wasn't until Joseph's father arrived and yelled out to the crowd, "It is my poor boy that has been drowned. Have you no regard for my grief?" Just then, silence fell over the great chuck hole. It wasn't until 6 p.m. that they recovered his body, and he was rushed to a local bathhouse, where Dr. Rogers theorized that a body could be revived even after it had been in the water for several hours. He worked on the boy's body until 9 p.m. with no success. Story 7. L'Angolo de Gigi, the iconic Italian restaurant run by Chef Gigi Ferruzzo, left an indelible mark on the culinary scene in the capital of Colombia in the 80s, not only for its exquisite flavors, but also for the dark rumors that surrounded it. It was said that the gourmet dishes served there, located on the road to La Calera, were prepared with human flesh. Little is known about Ferruzzo because it's known that he was a butcher from a young age and emigrated from Italy to settle in Colombia. Over time, he began associating with influential politicians in the country, and his behavior changed so much that many compared him to a mobster. Rumors spread that these politicians were not only his friends, but also the ones supplying the bodies he allegedly used in his cooking. because a supposed former member of the secret police claimed that the bodies from the wars against guerrillas and drug trafficking were sold to Ferruzo, and that on the day of the Palace of Justice siege, he was allowed to select the plumpest corpses. To this day, the whereabouts of these people are unknown, and that is why one of the theories is that he cooked them and fed them to his diners. The situation worsened when restaurant employees began to suspect something was wrong, as Ferruzo wouldn't allow anyone else to handle the meat, because he claimed it was imported from Italy, sent by his sister, although she later denied this. Eventually, after these rumors circulated, L'Angolo de Gigi closed its doors, and Ferruso disappeared over 40 years ago, leaving his fate shrouded in mystery. No one knows what happened to him. Story 8, during time working at Pearl Harbor National Memorial, I came across two horrifying tidbits. When the USS Oklahoma rolled over, it trapped sailors inside with no way of rescuing them. Cutting through the hull was impossible. A single gap would have caused the air pocket to collapse and flood the compartment. The workers still heard banging on the hull during Christmas, nearly 3 weeks after the attack, and plugged their ears with cotton to drown it out. The second tidbit is that by the time the workers got the ship upright and drained, workers were only collecting bits and pieces of remains. When caskets of the unknown sailors were exhumed to begin DNA identification, they discovered over 100 different strands of DNA from a single coffin. Story 9. I lost my leg to a bug bite that I had no knowledge of getting. One day my ankle swelled up and I thought it was just me getting old. It got progressively worse, and this was during COVID, so I didn't have a lot of options. After being up for a few days from pain and running a fever, I went to the emergency room and was diagnosed as having a sprained ankle. They gave me pain medication, which helped me sleep. I woke up after 18 hours to blisters under my ace bandage. I don't have any memory of anything until I woke up after my third surgery, of them removing more and more of my leg. It was necrotizing fasciitis. I lost everything from a medical misdiagnosis. I am currently just about starving to death as disability doesn't pay enough even though I worked my whole life and did everything I was supposed to. Story 10, prions, aka a misfolded protein in the brain that causes other proteins to misfold. This literally causes sponge brain or large holes in the brain. It is always fatal, and there is no known cure or treatment to slow the progression. Prion disease can be contagious or genetic. The contagious form cannot be killed by extreme heat, meaning that people with prion disease who have to have surgery, those instruments used during surgery cannot be sterilized. The most prevalent contagious form of prion disease is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, aka mad cow disease. Chronic wasting disease is another common form of prion disease, which mostly affects deer. While there are no human cases of CWD, it is theorized that the disease could be capable of infecting humans. Prion disease can also be sporadic, meaning the cause is not genetic or contagious, ultimately unknown. The most common form of prion disease, CJD, is mostly sporadic. Prion disease can lay dormant in the body for years, but once it is activated, the average prognosis is about 1 year. Story 11, on February 3rd, 1998, 20 people died when a cable car situated near the ski resort town of Cavallese, Italy, plummeted to the ground from 260 feet. It was caused when a United States Marine Corps EA-6B Prowler aircraft, which was flying excessively fast and too low during a low-altitude training mission, ultimately severed the cable that supported the cable car as it was descending from Mount Cermis. The disaster has been named the Strage del Kermes, Massacre of Cermis in Italy. The pilot, Captain Richard J. Ashby, and his navigator, Captain Joseph Schweitzer, were ultimately deemed not guilty of involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide for their roles in the disaster. However, they were found guilty of obstruction of justice and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman upon being found to have destroyed camcorder footage recorded from the plane's cockpit. Story 12. You are not immune to being brainwashed. People don't get sucked into cults because they are stupid. It could happen to you. Also, cults are not always religious, they just often are. Cults draw you in by making you feel smart and appreciated and loved. They douse you in affection and praise, and then they use your trust in them to isolate you from the voices of reason in your life. If someone is being super nice to you for a long time, making you feel special, and then they start telling you that you should cut off multiple people in your life, especially if it's the people telling you that something is wrong, that's a red flag. They will tell you that those people are unsupportive and that you don't need people like that in your life. This is a systematic way to cut off any resistance, so the only reasoning you will hear is their own, and all the while they will seem so kind and supportive. Do not get sucked into this trap. Story 13. A Quora channel named 911 Graphic Content has a lot of really fascinating and macabre articles on it. Two in particular spring to mind. One is a personal account of a witness, and another is a scientific breakdown. There's a membership fee to access the articles, but I found them thoroughly engaging and well worth at least a month's payment. The witness was someone doing triage before the towers fell, but after some people jumped, they were putting tags on the people or bodies or remains they found. So if anyone could survive, the doctors would gauge that at a distance via the colored tags. He came across a woman who had clearly fallen from the building, so at least 50 stories and probably more like 90. Her lower body was destroyed, but her upper torso and head were apparently intact. She yelled at him that she wasn't dead and to come back. The story is called Black Tag, and you can find it in a few different places. And on a video interview with the witness, the implication was that at least one person survived the fall from the towers enough to speak to someone. The scientific breakdown is about how long it would take an airliner to go from nose tip to tail into the building, and how long it takes for your mind to see, recognize, and understand something happening in front of you. There's a lot of physics mentioned, and at the end of the article is a video where you can test your reaction time. The fastest reaction time image was one I could totally see and understand. The implication is that some people, at the very back of Flight 11 and Flight 175, could see the explosion of glass and metal and fire in front of them before they died in the impact. Story 14. If you have elderly people in your life and they have their first fall, it really is the signal to the end. Once you start falling, your quality of life is going to go down quickly. Sure, I had a grandpa that fell at 85 and didn't pass until 89, but every single elderly person who falls really is on a ticking clock, and it's to do with not walking. I heard once there is a correlation between walking speed and mortality, and the faster you walk, generally the longer you live. After a fall, if you can't walk, all the other health risks associated with lack of exercise creep in. These issues further prevent walking, and it snowballs to death. Weightlifting and having muscle is a way to protect yourself a bit from this happening, but it gets hard to build muscle when you are older, and aging actually results in muscle loss. So get buff in your 40s and hold it till your 70s and live. Story 15. Our crew went out to a mall to do some repair work in the main electrical room. The area around one of the main electrical panels was cordoned off with safety tape. The entire top half of the panel was mostly fused. What wasn't fused together was badly burnt and melted. When we had all gotten into the electrical room, our boss closed the door and said, "Full disclosure, that smell is burnt flesh." A maintenance man was working on the panel when a pry bar he had used to get the dead front off fell across the main lugs. Fortunately, he did not survive. You will all be wearing full hazmat gear while working in this room. EMS did try to get as much of him as they could out of the panel, but there may be some residue. Story 16. The adoption industry, especially infant adoption, is actually human trafficking and sometimes genocide, dressed up in a social justice trench coat. It's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry that quite literally profits off selling children. Just Google Georgia Tan or the 60s scoop. Adoption has a long history of being used as a tool of genocide and colonization, especially for Native communities. It disconnects a person from their culture and community, which was what was done to me. Even foster care is highly questionable. It emerged around the same time that enslavement was ended and was utilized as a way for farmers to get free labor. Nowadays, states steal money from foster children, and roughly 90% of them will be abused within the system. Most children who are in foster care have some family who want them home. Neglect is often a code word for poverty. My own adoptive parents thought they were saving a baby, but my adoption never should have been legal, and according to the UN, it was an act of genocide. My adoption paperwork was edited because I was worth more money without my heritage. I am white presenting. White infants can be worth up to $60,000. The prices are based on ability and race. Adoptees are overrepresented within all psychiatric settings, like inpatient and outpatient facilities, rehabs, the troubled teen industry, and psychiatric emergency room, which in the US generates even more money. We are at times more likely to attempt to end our life than the general public. We are also overrepresented within the prison system. Again, generates more money in the US. And among serial killers. Story 17. Considering how many wars there have been in just over a century and the number of unstable and hostile nations in possession of nukes at the ready, for just one of them to have a particularly bad day, the likelihood of mankind existing more than another 50 years looks exceedingly grim. That being said, there is way too much time wasted on grudges, arguments, and worrying about your calorie intake. Be kind and seek common ground and compassion for one another. Have that cheesecake. Stop doom scrolling and get out and ride motorcycles, go skydiving, or whatever sounds fun to you. Ignore all the hate and judgmental BS everywhere. Yesterday I was 25 and full of life. Now I'm 55 and full of regret for countless things. With my health, I may not see 60. I'm going to make the most of what I have left. Story 18. Seems to be a lot of discussion on breaking hips. As someone who worked in trauma surgery, I've seen a lot of hip fractures. A lot of those patients would have been better off not having surgery IMO. The mortality rate is very high, and most patients who break their hip are already very sick or infirm. Most of the surgeons performing those hip fracture repairs have stated they would rather not have the surgery if they break theirs. Frankly, I'm with them. If I break my hip, just keep increasing the morphine until I go to sleep for good. Please have living wills and explicitly tell your family members what you would and would not like for life-saving measures. Even with that, my grandfather ended up on a ventilator, which was against his written wishes, thanks due to my uncle. Story 19. According to Statista.com, as of the first quarter of 2024, the millennials own roughly 9.4% of all wealth in the United States. There are multiple posts out here by some millennials that regret messing up and wish that they tried harder, but the numbers are really stacked against us. The baby boomers hold the largest percentage of all wealth in the United States at 51.8% as of the first quarter of 2024. How exactly could a whole generation strike it rich and be well made if the numbers are not matching up to begin with? I have spent time on r/collapse and other places and read multiple reports regarding the economic conditions, and things seem to be getting worse and decaying across the board in different ways. While the prices regarding the basic goods like housing and food have gone up across the board, there's a lot more people coming into existence compared to 20 years ago. Story 20. The brain-eating amoeba, Naegleria fowleri, is a microorganism sometimes present in standing water that infects human brains. Imagine you go for a swim and afterwards you aren't feeling so well. You think it's maybe a cold or the flu. 2 days in bed will fix this, but they don't. After 2 days, you have headaches, stiff neck. You're just hurting and it gets worse. You really can't eat. That just makes you sick. And somehow you notice you're not tasting any of it either. Eventually, you notice your vision is kind of wonky. But you don't know that's because, frankly, your nervous system is being eaten by the infection so very slowly. The fact one side of your face sags all of a sudden is your sign that something is terribly wrong. By the time you get to the hospital, you're paralyzed in parts of your body. You're confused most of the time. You can't walk and you're hallucinating. You're either blind, deaf, have no sense of smell and taste, and a patchwork sense of touch, or all of the above. You're in a kind of excruciating pain. No amount of painkillers can quench, as the parasite has consumed most of your brain, and nothing can help you get away from their slow munching on your nervous system. Eventually, you can't even cry anymore. 2 weeks after your nice evening swim, you're dead, and by that time it's a relief. There's an episode of Doctor House about this particular middle finger display of God. Story 21. One nuclear bombs are a lot more horrifying than you think. Most people think that you just get vaporized instantly, but most of the time it's not the case. To be vaporized, you got to be at ground zero, where the bomb explodes and the fireball forms. At ground zero, literally anything vaporizes, like drops of water on a hot pan. Meanwhile, a heat wave caused by the fireball spreads for kilometers and burns literally anything in a second, even people. If they are lucky, they'll get hit by the shock wave after a few seconds and die, but sometimes these people survive. There are lots of stories told by the Hiroshima survivors. They tell of people covered in horrifying burns basically everywhere in the body, with the skin just hanging and falling and their eyes melted by the heat. Lots of people even slowly burned alive under the debris of their houses, and most of the time, they died alone. Now imagine this. You're chilling in your house with your parents, and then you see a flash brighter than the sun, and you feel your skin boiling from the heat. Then, after a few seconds, boom! The blast wave and the sound reach you, and your house just falls to the ground like a sandcastle. Let's say that you miraculously survive. You would see hell, flaming debris everywhere, smoke and dust that makes it hard to breathe, people, maybe even your loved ones, stuck in the debris, burned or maybe vaporized, heat so high that your shoes melt, people just wandering around with their skin falling and their eyes melted, and one of the most horrible things, radiation, a silent killer that will slowly and painfully kill the survivors, sounds like hell. Story 22. In the realm of natural phenomena, there's a condition known as red tide, which occurs when certain types of algae bloom excessively in the ocean. These algae can produce potent toxins that contaminate shellfish, leading to poisoning in humans and marine life. What makes this particularly alarming is that the toxins can cause severe neurological symptoms and even death, and the algae can multiply rapidly under the right conditions, creating widespread ecological and health crises. The impact of red tides can be devastating for both the environment and human health. Story 23. At any point, our sun could let loose a solar flare that's so strong it absolutely blasts one half of the planet, destroying the ozone layer, which protects us from harmful cosmic radiation like sunlight, and setting fire to the remaining atmosphere on the other side, killing basically everything on the burnt half instantly, ruining most of the atmosphere, and killing nearly everything else over time from starvation, radiation poisoning, smoke inhalation, lack of oxygen, dehydration, etc., etc. And we wouldn't even know it was coming because light moves too fast for any of our telescopes to see. And even if we did see it coming, distance between us and the sun takes on average 8 minutes and 30 seconds for light to travel. So us humans would not possibly have the time to get underground to try to survive. Don't worry, life will continue. There's enough extremophiles to build up a global ecosystem, and the ozone layer will rebuild. But humans are messed up. Story 24. We're overdue for a geomagnetic reversal. This is when the Earth's magnetic field flips. If it happened today, there would be massive communication disruptions globally. Migratory birds, whales, and other species that use the field for navigation would become lost, most likely leading to a huge reduction in their numbers and potentially a collapse of local ecosystems. Compass and navigation technologies failed, and global power grids were disrupted. The last reversal happened 780,000 years ago. It's estimated that it happens on average every 500,000 years. As you might have guessed, we don't entirely know what causes it, but for what it's worth, sometimes it can be as long as 50 million years between reversals, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Story 25. For my master's thesis, I conducted an in-depth study of Linux kernel security. The experience made me realize how vulnerable the operating systems running our world truly are. Remember the CrowdStrike incident? Imagine something similar, but on Linux and potentially far more severe. During my research, I discovered a method to crash almost any Linux system in about 10 seconds using a basic method. The only protection against this vulnerability would be to run the entire system off-grid. I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what I'd uncovered with this POC. If I were to fully develop it, a simple checksum error could potentially leave everything wide open. I mean, everything. My professor was impressed and encouraged me to pursue a PhD to continue this research. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of fully developing this vulnerability, only to have someone else potentially discover and exploit it later, messed me up so badly that I purged my POC and servers after finishing the thesis. To this day, I still think about it from time to time.